Hi guys, welcome to my revision series video. Now today I'm going to go through with you the strategic business leader. I'm going to give you the bird's view of the whole syllabus within one video. So I hope that this video will prove useful in your upcoming exam. So enjoy. Now, when we talk about strategic business leader, so as we know, every organization, we need a leader. So what is a strategic leader all about? A strategic leader is one which is future oriented. Number two, it is one which is able to spot opportunities and trend. So what makes a strategic leader? So it is important to identify what are the traits that are required to be a strategic leader. Now, your examination question may actually put you in the role of a consultant where you may be required to identify or assess what are the role that the current CEO has or don't have, or evaluate the prospective candidate that is going to be recruited. So when we talk about the traits of a strategic leader, now basically we are looking at number one, having the intellectual ability. Number two, interpersonal skill. Number three, emotional stability. And number four, ability to admit error. So it is essential that a strategic leader possesses all these four traits. You need to have some intellectual ability. You must have your experience, your knowledge in the field that you are managing. Interpersonal skills is important when you manage your workforce. Emotional stability, because a strategic leader is expected to make decisions. So this is when your emotional stability comes into play. And your willingness to admit errors in your decision making will prove important, because you will need to admit error, cut your losses, and move on from there. So that is the first thing about a strategic leader. So these traits of a strategic leader is important. Now, the second thing is a strategic leader must have these traits, because these traits are essential for a strategic leader to come out with the right strategy for the organization. Now, when you talk about strategy, so when coming out with strategy for an organization, a strategic leader is responsible for coming out with the strategy. So when coming out with strategy for an organization, a strategic leader must take into consideration its stakeholders. When we talk about stakeholders, so we have to consider the role and influences a stakeholder has in an organization. So our strategy formulation must consider these groups of stakeholders. So when considering the influences and interests of this stakeholder, so remember about Mandela stakeholder mapping. So examination question can test a student on the role of a stakeholder within an organization's strategy. So when we are being tested on stakeholders' influences and power, so don't forget about Mandela. Now, moving on further from there, so when we talk about stakeholder or the role of stakeholder, now there is one important one, is agency theory. So what happened here is, in terms of agency theory, we know that basically the manager or directors is appointed by shareholders. So the directors are basically the agent of the shareholder. So this is basically the agency theory. So moving on from here, when we look at the role of a director, now it is important that you know several elements within this role of directors. Number one, we need to identify the difference between the role of a CEO in an organization versus a chairman. What are the benefits of having a separate person for CEO and chairman? The essential of knowing the appointment, removal, and also the remuneration of a director. And finally, also knowing the role of non-executive directors. Why is it essential to have a non-executive directors? Basically, the appointment of the NED is to reduce the conflict of interest between the management and shareholders. But do bear in mind, the NED don't have managerial responsibility. They are basically offering an independent view because they are not full-time employee of the company. Okay, so make sure you know as well what or who should be the members of the NED. Now, the next part, we go back to our strategy formulation. Now, when we talk about strategy formulation, besides considering the impact of stakeholders, we will also need to consider culture. The impact of the organization's culture on an organization's strategy. Now, when we talk about culture, so it is always associated with cultural web. So what is this cultural web is all about? It is basically being used by organization to analyze and understand its culture or even to recommend changes. So it is also important to acknowledge that a strategic leader has a role in shaping an organization's culture. A strategic leader defines and manages the organization's culture. Okay, now moving on a little bit further, when we talk about strategy, so strategy of an organization is affected by the stakeholders, the culture. Now, the next one is in terms of the environment. An organization's environment has a role in determining its strategy. To understand an organization's environment, we can always use PASTEL for the macro environment. We can also look at the national environment by considering Porter's diamond. So Porter's diamond will help us to understand the national environment, what a country has to offer. So we will consider the four factors within the Porter's diamond: factor condition, demand condition, related and supporting industry, strategy, structure, and rivalry. And finally, we will look at the market and the industry. So when we talk about the market and the industry, so what is important here is looking at the attractiveness of a particular market or industry. So this is where the role of Porter's 5 forces comes into play for us to understand how competitive is the market, and from there understanding the attractiveness. Now, another aspect is when we consider strategy is to look at the corporate social responsibility. So any strategy that is decided by the management, we have to remember the role our organization play as a corporate citizen. Now, before I move on, I would like to emphasize that this video gives us an overview of the SBL syllabus. What is important here is that I have prepared a revised with me video on chapter by chapter basis. So if you are my normal class students, you are strongly encouraged to go through this video for further explanation of all this model that is being mentioned. Now, let's move on further. A strategic leader, besides being involved in strategy formulation, a strategic leader is also one that is responsible for a proper corporate governance. Now, when we talk about corporate governance, the role of a strategic leader is to balance the interests of the organization with stakeholder, to help to make the company making a better decision, providing information to the right people and at the right time. So to ensure sufficient information, not too much nor too little. So a corporate governance is basically a system of rule, practices, and process where it is to balance, the important thing is to balance the interests of the company's stakeholder. Now, continuing further, so we were talking about strategy. So a strategic leader is one that is responsible for the organization strategy. So when considering a suitable strategy, so there are a lot of options. So now it brings us to the next question, strategic choices. So deciding what are the best options a company should pursue. When we talk about strategic choices, the very first thing you should consider is competitive advantage. An organization must have its own competitive advantage. A strategic leader will reflect back what is the organization's competitive advantage. The inability to identify your own competitive advantage will affect the long-term survival of your organization. So when we talk about competitive advantage, there is one over here, cost leadership, being the lowest cost provider, differentiation, with the emphasis on quality, how you differentiate your company, product or service from your competitor, and focus. which we can actually split into cost focus or differentiation focus. And the next one is growth and diversification. Now, after considering and determining your competitive advantage, the next important thing is an organization need to pursue a strategy of growth and diversification. Now, when considering your organization's growth and diversification, we have to look at, number one, the ENSOF, product market mix matrix. Now, under the ENSOF, product market mix matrix, we will look at market penetration, market development, product development, diversification. So how we employ the matrix. Besides the ENSOF, we also have the SAF model, which is also used basically to evaluate between different choices that an organization has. So when you are presented with examination questions of different strategy, evaluating the strategy, so don't forget about the SAF model. And what if in the event you are given a strategic business unit? That means you have a portfolio. So the keyword here is portfolio. So don't forget about our Boston Consulting Group matrix. Okay. So when we talk about deciding between different strategy, our strategic choices, okay, so now this will bring us into two things. Okay, because when we talk about strategic choices, so it will actually give rise, a different strategy that an organization choose will actually give rise to risk. So the next chapter related to here is in terms of risk management. Now, one of the way to reduce or mitigate an organization risk is through internal control. So now let us start with risk management. Now basically in terms of risk management, so there are several steps that we can pursue in order to manage our organization risk. So the very first thing is obviously to identify the responsibility for risk. So the responsibility for risk definitely lies with the senior management. However, at times, these risk management are delegated to a risk manager who will be responsible with coming out with steps in order to manage the risk. Now, however, okay, we also have another category, which is the risk committee. Now, basically, the risk committee here will play a more of a monitoring and review role. Okay, so a risk manager will be directly involved in the risk management. Meanwhile, a risk management committee is more of reviewing the report, okay, and also monitoring the internal control. Now, the second one is after you have identified who should be responsible for the risk, then we have risk appetite. Okay, now when we talk about risk appetite, it's the two things about risk averse and risk seeking. So determining whether the organization is risk taker or risk seeking. Now, the next one is identify the risk. Now, risk comes in many different forms. So you have strategic risk, risk associated with the long-term survival of the organization. So you have your business risk or operational risk. You have forex risk, environmental risk, social risk. So the list goes on. Okay, so do acknowledge that risk comes in many forms. So one of the possible questions in exam is you may be tested to identify different risks that exist within the strategy. Okay, now after we have identified all the risks within the strategy, then definitely we have to assess the risk. So how significant is the risk to the organization? So when assessing the risk, basically we will consider two things over here. That is regarding the probability the risk will occur. Okay, and the second one is the impact of the risk. Okay, then the next thing is, after you have assessed the risk, is to respond to risk. So now when responding to risk, we have two things here: alarm as low as reasonably possible, and also TARA. Okay, so what does TARA basically stands for? Transfer, accept, reduce, or avoid the risk. And finally, we have to go to the last step, that is to monitor. Now, when we talk about monitoring, because risk is not stagnant, so there may be continuous change to risk, so therefore there is a need for monitoring and review. Okay, and after that, once we know about our risks, so obviously the next part is in terms of what we should do to mitigate our risks. So this is where internal control comes in. So my advice is learn up on the role of internal audit, the benefits of internal audit, and also failure, identifying the failure of internal control. Okay, so that would form an important part. Okay, now when we talk about this internal control, so that brings us to another aspect, that is our organization. Now, just now we were talking about the role of a director. Okay, so within an organization. So what we have in the first place is the internal, okay, different organizations configuration. So we have the internal relationship, okay, which is related to simple functional divisional matrix structure. So learn up on that. And you have external relationship, SSO, GBS, outsourcing. So you have in external relationship. So read up on those, just know them, okay, in case. All right. Now, one important part we have here is on the Baldrige model. So what is actually this model all about? Okay, this particular model emphasizes on achieving excellence performance. So easier said than done. How can an organization achieve an excellent performance? So it goes like this. An excellent performance actually starts off with a leader. So the role a strategic leader play in an organization. So the leadership will determine the directions of the organization. So therefore, a leader will come out with strategy. So a strategy is important in order to achieve excellence. Now, how do we know that the organization has successfully achieved excellence? The organization's ability to meet a customer requirement. An organization that is able to meet customer expectation is one that is excellent. Now, to meet customer expectation, what is important is the workforce, the people behind the organization. So the workforce must have the skills and the motivation to achieve the success. Now, and this workforce must be supported by operations. And efficient and effective operations will ensure that the workforce is able to contribute towards the excellent performance. And finally, how do we know that the organization has achieved excellence performance? That is to measure the results. to measure the results whether have we as an organization achieved an excellent performance. Now, along the way, my explanation was focusing on the workforce. So in terms of workforce, now the issue that we have here is empowerment and talent management. So actually, for an organization to go through empowerment or delayering, what is important is we must have the right people. So it is essential that we go through talent management. Now, in terms of talent management, there are three important things that we must look at. Number one is to identify talent. Number two, and also identify poor performing. Number two is retaining talent. And number three is recruiting talent. So these are three essential things within our talent management. Okay, now coming back to here, earlier we were talking about strategic choices. Now our strategic choices will actually lead to a strategic change. Okay, our strategic choices will lead to a strategic change. When a strategic leader has determined a suitable strategy for the organization, so it is time to implement a change. So when we talk about strategic change, so the very first thing is to identify the types of change. So whether we are going to go for evolution, adaptation, revolutions, or even reconstructions. Now, when we talk about strategic change, it is basically involving changes to the business or marketing plan to achieve a competitive advantage. So it doesn't matter the type of change that an organization decided to pursue, because what is important is we have to also consider the contextual framework of the change. Now, when we look at the contextual framework for the change, so definitely we are considering the Balogun, Hope, and Haley. So in this case, we have to look at the 8 factors within the contextual. And from the contextual framework for change, we will then have the Kurt-Lewin model. Now, under this particular model, it is all about the change process. So it is referring, this particular model, Kurt-Lewin, is basically referring to the steps that organization goes through when there is a strategic change. So the steps involved in this Kurt-Lewin process, the very first process is to unfreeze. So basically is to unfreeze your existing process, your existing procedure. Number 2 is to implement the change. And the third thing is to refreeze. Basically, in refreeze is to emphasize on the benefits that the change has brought upon the organization. So this is to give the motivation to the employee about the change has brought for the organization. Now, after the Kurt-Lewin process of change, now we have the next one, which is the Poppit model. Now, basically, under the POPIT model, now, what we are looking at in this case, it's all about looking or having a holistic view of an organization. This model helps an organization to identify the change for improvement. So it identifies where the problem lies within the organization. So it looks at 4 aspects within the organization. So which is the organization, the information technology, the people, and the processes. So the POPIT model is all about having a holistic view of the change, identifying where could potential problem lies within the strategic change. Now, after the POPIT model, now it's time to implement the business process change. Now, in terms of the business process change, we have several things. The Harmon's process strategy. Number 2, we have the business process outsourcing. And finally, the business process redesign, which I normally explain in class, part T. Now, finally, after we have all the business process change and etc., now it's time to implement it. So we have to go through project management. Now, when we go through project management, so the very first thing, in terms of project management, it is basically all about ensuring our project is completed within the time and also resources and achieving our objective. So to ensure a successful project, so we must have, number 1, considering the triple constraint. It helps us, a triple constraint helps us to understand better the issue that will affect the success of the project so that we can better manage it. So the triple constraint involves the scope, time, and also cost. Second part is the risk management. Now, in terms of risk management, so it is best illustrated by IAPM. So P here. So IAPM. So basically, I, identify the risk. A, analyze the risk. P, plan for the risk. And M, monitor risk. So when we talk about plan for the risk, then basically we are still looking at TARA. Okay. Now, the last part is in terms of project life cycle. Now, for project life cycle, we have the first stage, initiation stage. Now, in terms of initiation stage, you need to know the project initiation document, the business case. Second, we need to identify the costs and benefits. under the benefits realization, number 3, we need planning. It helps a proper project planning, helps to communicate and coordinate, and also providing measures of success, identifying the resources needed. Then after that, we proceed to execution and control of the project management. So this is when we have to identify the project manager who is responsible to ensure the desired results are achieved. Then we have the project sponsor who provides the resources for the project, and also the project owner, the one who benefits from the project. And finally, the completion of the project management, which involve the benefits realization review. So this is on our project management. And finally, one last important thing that a strategic leader plays an important role, that is in terms of ethics. The ethical principle. Now, when we talk about the ethical principle, so first, if your question is asking about individual, so always think about the code of ethics, PICCO, professional behavior, integrity, confidentiality, competence and due care, and finally, objectivity. Now, if the question is basically on business ethics, that means looking at your organizations and its ethics, always remember about Tucker's 5 questions model, and also do take note about the existence of ethical threats, such as advocacy, self-review, and etc. So this wraps up my video on SBL, Bird's View, the whole syllabus summarized over here. So I hope this video will prove valuable in your upcoming exam. Good luck.